We've all heard the story, right? That the Bible was basically created by a committee. That some Roman emperor, handpicked the books that would help him control the masses. It's this gripping story you see in movies and all over the internet. But what if that story isn't just wrong? What if it's a carefully crafted lie that's actually hiding something truly beautiful from you?
The legend goes something like this. It's the year 325 AD. The Emperor Constantine, he needs to unify his sprawling empire. So he calls together all these bishops for a big meeting at a place called Nicaea. And the story claims that in some back room, they held a vote on which books would make it into the official Bible and which would be thrown out and forgotten forever.
But here's the thing. That story, it's almost entirely fiction. It's a myth that's been supercharged by novels and viral videos. And look, the real danger of this myth isn't just that it's bad history. It's that it stops us from seeing the actual story, which is, frankly, far more incredible. So let's pull back the curtain and let's start by taking this myth apart, piece by piece.
Okay, first things first. We have to tackle this idea of the Emperor's Bible, because it's a story of power, conspiracy, and control that has really captured our imagination.
So let's separate the Hollywood version from the historical reality. The popular myth, the one you'll find in books like the Vinci Code, says the Council of Nicaea decided the Bible. But when you actually look at the documents from the council, the history is crystal clear. Nicaea was called to solve a huge theological debate called the Arian controversy. It was a fight about the nature of Jesus, whether he was divine or created. If you read the records from that council, there is not one single mention of a vote or even a debate about which books should be in the Bible. It just didn't happen.
All right, so if the big conspiracy theory is a bust, where did the Bible come from? And this is where it gets really interesting because it forces us to ask a much better, much deeper question.
You see, we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question isn't who chose the books, as if a bunch of powerful men could just bestow authority on some ancient scrolls. No, the early church believed these books already had authority. So the real question for them was, how do we recognize the books that have been inspired by God all along? It's a huge difference, right? Recognizing authority versus creating it.
And this wasn't something that happened overnight in a secret meeting. It was this organic process that unfolded over hundreds of years. And the early Christians were guided by 4 key principles. You can think of them as a kind of measuring stick, which, fun fact, is what the Greek word Canon, or canon, actually means.
So what was on this measuring stick? Well, the early church basically asked 4 big questions of any text to see if it measured up. They were Apostolicity, Orthodoxy, Antiquity, and Catholicity. Let's just quickly break down what each of those really means.
First up, Apostolicity. This was the big one. Did the text have a direct connection to Jesus' original apostles? Was it written by an actual eyewitness, like Matthew or John? Or maybe by a close associate who was mentored by them, like Mark was to Peter or Luke was to Paul? It had to come straight from the source.
Second was orthodoxy. Think of this as a consistency check. Did the text line up with the core foundational beliefs about Jesus that had been passed down from the very beginning? They called this the regula fide, or the rule of faith. It had to sound and feel like the truth they already knew. Third, antiquity. This one is pretty straightforward. Was the book actually old? Did it come from the 1st century, when the apostles were still alive or when their followers were leading the church? Any text that just suddenly appeared hundreds of years later claiming to be a lost gospel was a huge red flag. And finally, Catholicity. And that's Catholic with a small c, which just means universal. Was this book being used by churches all over the known world, from Rome to Egypt to modern-day Turkey? If believers everywhere were reading it, copying it, and using it in their worship, that was a powerful sign that the Spirit was confirming its value to the whole church. Okay, so now that we have these 4 keys, let's actually put them to the test. Let's see how they work in the real world by using them on one of the most famous so-called forbidden books out there. Let's talk about the Gospel of Judas. When this text was rediscovered in the 20th century, it made huge headlines. It claimed Judas wasn't a traitor. He was actually the hero. So could this be one of those books that Constantine and his council tried to bury? Well, let's run it through our 4 keys and see. So the story in the Gospel of Judas completely flips the script. In this version, Judas is the only one who really gets Jesus, and his so-called betrayal is actually a good thing. He's helping Jesus escape the prison of his physical body. Why? Well, because this text comes from a belief system called Gnosticism, which taught that the entire physical world is evil,
a mistake made by a lesser God.
And this just shows the clash perfectly. On one side, you have the apostolic teaching. Creation is good, God actually became flesh to save it, and salvation is a gift for everyone. But on the other side, you have the Gnostic belief. Creation is an evil trap. Jesus wanted to escape his flesh, and salvation is some secret knowledge for a chosen few. The Gospel of Judas completely fails the Orthodoxy test. It also fails the Antiquity test. Scholars date it to the late 2nd century, way too late. And since it was never used everywhere, it fails the Catholicity test too. And honestly, making sense of these huge differences is kind of the reason we make these explainers in the first place.
So what does all this mean for us today? Because tearing down this myth isn't just about winning a historical argument. It's about replacing a story of conspiracy and fear with a foundation of genuine hope.
The reality is just so much more beautiful than the myth. The Bible's table of contents wasn't hammered out in a single moment of political power. It was recognized slowly, organically, across continents, and over hundreds of years by communities of regular, everyday believers who read these texts, lived by them, and heard the voice of their shepherd in them. And this points to a much deeper truth, which is really the bedrock of Christian hope. The belief is that if God is truly in control, then he would never allow the essential truth about Jesus, the core message of our salvation, to be lost or hijacked or swapped out for a fraud. The preservation of these texts isn't seen as some fragile human project. It's seen as an act of God's own faithfulness.
So if you remember just one thing from our time together, let it be this. The books of the Bible weren't chosen by a committee. They were recognized by the church.
So I want to leave you with this to think about. How does knowing the Bible was recognized by countless faithful believers over centuries, instead of being chosen by a few powerful men at a single meeting, change your perspective on its trustworthiness? I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments below. I really do read them. And hey, if this explainer was helpful, if it cleared things up for you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe. We're trying to build a community here that explores these big questions with clarity and most of all, with hope.
Thanks so much for watching.